Hello everybody and welcome to another week in review, this time of the division's 2nd US Indian Head and Koruck 559, suggested by Nicholas Breichler and Sweden Owns 123 respectively. Remember that if you'd like to see any specific decks covered throughout this series, leave them in the comments below and I'll either route you to where they already exist or I will get them into the pipeline in chronological order. But without any ado, let's hop right into my first iteration of 2nd US Indian Head. Now, full disclosure, I'm going to have a really easy time pronouncing all of these names as this is my native language for the first time throughout this series. Well, second, I guess, if you count Spearhead. It's also worth noting that I've had a lot of time to really perfect this deck, so if I don't make a lot of changes throughout the week to this division, you'll understand why. I've been playing this ever since its release, and I absolutely adore this division. Leading us off in the Recon tab is arguably one of the best units in the game, and in my opinion, the best unit in the game, the Ranger Marauders. These guys come in the really fast 4 GPA transport, they're nearly invisible, they carry more bazooka rounds than the dedicated bazooka teams, they have the Willie Pete for clearing out infantry at 100 meters range, and on top of that they have 3 Thompson submachine guns that really help in that 100 meter range engagement. Because of this, there's not a terrible lot that these guys can't handle, aside from far-ranged engagements or being engaged by a tank at further than 500 meters or so. All that said, because these guys are nearly invisible, it's really unlikely that the enemy is going to spot them at that range, especially if you're playing with them carefully. I typically send all 3 of these up immediately in my opening to various spots that I'm going to be contesting, be they forests or inside of cities, or even sometimes in the open, as these guys will just walk right through that area. They will completely obliterate any infantry squad that comes within 100 meters of them, most of them that is. Sturm Pioneer will still give them trouble, or flame troops of the like. They will completely obliterate any tank that they run into because they carry the bazooka and an obscene amount of ammunition. Add that on top of the fact that they come in at a forced 2-star veterancy and their 3 submachine guns. These guys are just unstoppable gods and I can't praise them enough. I bring in 1 card in Phase A and 1 card in Phase B just to maximize the number I can get, as well as maximizing their usability in the early phases. Honest to God, I don't even think this is opinion-based, I think this is just abject fact. If you're playing 2nd Infantry and you're not bringing in the Ranger Marauders, both cards of them, then you're playing this deck wrong. They're just the entire reason that you should play this division. I think that they are one of the best units in the game, and I just don't see a way you could play this division without using these guys. Moving on to the Infantry tab, I bring in a Phase A card of the Basics to be my sort of spammy meat infantry, a Phase A card of the Engineer Leaders, a Phase A card of the Rangers, which come in the relatively quick duck-out transport, and usually I send these guys to Forest to back up my Ranger Marauders, and a Phase A card of the Rifles early, coming in the M2A1 half-track. Now, the Rifles are quite pricey, so I would avoid using these guys as much as you otherwise would use line infantry. However, you could also drop these down to the GMC transport, bringing them to a much cheaper and more manageable price. I just really wanted them to come in a transport that was going to be usable in combat, as these transports really do harry the German forces much more than they harry the Allied forces in return. This is because on the Allied team there's a preponderance of PTRS, PTRD, and similar weapons that have a decent range against these sort of light vehicles that can be used to harry enemy half-tracks or enemy light tanks at 500 meters range. While that is true of the Allies, on the Axis team there are very few of these available. Some of the Hungarian divisions and some of the stranger German divisions have access to PTRSs or their version of them. However, for the most part you're not going to see very many of them over there. Because of this, these half-tracks are absolutely invaluable in this division. Moving on to Phase B, I bring in a card of the Rangers LMG, and these guys are fantastic. For 20 points, they will pin down almost anything in that mid-ranged engagement, and they pack a very long-ranged engagement as opposed to most infantry. I also bring in a Phase B card of the Rangers and a Phase B card of the Rifles late. Because the Rifles late were already quite expensive enough, I did bring these in the GMC because I couldn't imagine spending 45 points on these guys, and for the most part, later on in the game, I was just using these to hold points or to be meat for the meat god, so I just kind of didn't want them to be very expensive while I was doing that. In Phase C, I also brought in a card of the Rifles Late, as well as a card of the Demolition Group, and the Demolition Group are an interesting beast. They are phase locked to Phase C, and they're quite expensive to boot. However, they do feature a bazooka, and they're the only infantry-based bazooka available in this division that isn't also on a Ranger Marauder or a dedicated bazooka squad. Because of this, I usually bring these guys in just to sort of be my late-game bazooka squads, as well as they have that flamethrower, so they're just as capable in those close-ranged engagements as the Ranger Marauders. All that said, these guys do end up letting me down quite a lot, so I don't think you'd be remiss in dropping them out of this division. Moving on to the tank tab, I brought in a Phase A card of the M5A1s, a Phase A card of the M4A1s, a Phase B card of the Rhinos, and a Phase C card of the Shermans again. Mostly, I just wanted a ton of different armored options in this division. I find that the Sherman is good enough at no stars veterancy that I can't really justify jumping it up, even though the veterancy curve is quite lenient on these vehicles. For the most part, I just use these guys as additional infantry support or additional suppressing fire while on those mid-ranged engagements, or to sneak them through a forest where they're almost unstoppable because they'll fire their cannons at tanks and also fire their little 14x5mm cannon. Yes, I said it, 14.5mm cannon. Comment section, go to town. Moving on to the support tab, I bring in a Phase A card of the Flamethrowers, which I could see my way into dropping. Typically, the Flamethrowers were doing the same job as the Ranger Marauders and the Rangers, as well as the Engineer Leader, so it was kind of just a lot of things doing the exact same job. On top of that, this support tab is actually quite bloated. There's a lot of things that I'd really like to have, however, I did end up sticking with the Flamethrowers throughout the whole week. I also brought in a Phase A card of the M1919 machine guns. These guys were just my typical machine guns, and I ended up bringing in another card in Phase B just to give me that huge advantage over enemy infantry at 1200 meters. I also brought in a Phase A card of the Ranger T30s, which I originally did not bring in my first few iterations of this deck back when it released. However, over the year, I've really come to enjoy these units. They fire very quickly, they pack heat shells that can be fired in enemy tanks, they're incredibly cheap and come in at a Force 2-star veterancy, which really just makes them all the better. Rounding out my Phase A, I bring in the Commander. In Phase B, I bring in the aforementioned machine guns as well as the supply trucks just to sort of round out that phase. If you're wondering why no Crocodile, it's because it's phase locked to Phase C, and typically I was just using these as meat shields anyway, so I didn't know that they were really worth it. I could see my way into dropping the flamethrowers for them, however I would likely just drop the flamethrowers for the bigger machine guns in Phase A just to really lock down that early city engagement. In the anti-tank tab, I brought in a Phase A card of the M1 guns as well as a Phase A card of the M5 guns. My thinking here was the M5s could deal with the really heavy tanks that I might run into, but for the most part I didn't end up using the M5s for anything, as the M1s were typically more than enough. In Phase B, I brought in another M1 as well as the Hellcats at a 1-star veterancy. I do the Hellcats at 1 star because I really don't want the Hellcats to miss under any circumstance. They're my unit that I probably spend the most time micromanaging in this division, and because of that I really need them to perform at or better than 65% accuracy. While this is their listed accuracy, stressors and other things might come into effect to really drive that down, and I just don't want that to be a problem, so I ended up bringing these guys in at 1 star just to buff them up to that 3. Typically speaking, I was using these guys in pairs to try and surround and kill enemy heavy tanks such as Tigers or King Tigers that I might be running into depending on the division that I'm fighting. For the most part, these guys have been fantastic, and especially since the APCR buff, they're really something to behold. Granted, you can no longer fire toggle these guys, which really made them busted overpowered at 50 points, but the fact that they travel so quickly on road really blows open a front if you need them to. Unfortunately, you can't bring them in Phase A as they are phase locked to Phases B and C. However, I think I would if it were available. These guys would be an excellent addition to my opening just to try and snipe out early transports or even get a good upper hand on enemy heavy tanks. My AA tab was fairly standard. I brought in a Phase A card of Beaufort's 40mm and a Phase C card of the same thing, both coming in the GMC transport. While these are available to bring in the half-track, I didn't need my AA to be any more expensive as I was already struggling with the idea of bringing them in. Typically, I would just push through the front and force the enemy not to spend points on planes to begin with, as this deck is quite strong at doing that, but if I needed to, I needed them to be cheap. In the artillery tab, I brought in a Phase A card of the 105mm M3 howitzers, and I brought these ones specifically in because 1, they came in the transport, 2, they also feature heat shells, so if I had them on the front lines, they could potentially box out enemy tanks, and 3, they were cheap enough to bring in the supply truck transports, so it wasn't really going to kill me. However, you could swap these out for the 107s if you had extra supplies, and I think that would be a perfectly reasonable call. I also brought in a Phase A card of the M3 artillery observers, and these guys, while they only had 2 shots, typically did the job I needed them to. They opened up the city or the forest or whatever it was I was fighting for, and allowed me to push through. In Phase B, I rounded out my command structure with the artillery commanders, as well as a xylophone card just to get that sweet xylophone action. Now, typically speaking, the xylophone just kind of opened up fronts for me, but I did use it a few times to stun heavy tanks in order to assist my Hellcats, as if the Hellcat is even looked at funny, it will explode. In my air tab, I brought in a P-47-23 in Phase A with the fighter bomber munitions. In Phases B and C, I brought in no-star cards of the anti-tank versions of the same plane. Now, these anti-tank planes, while they are quite expensive, in pairs will kill most any tank in the game. I was using these if I ever needed to take down a King Tiger, as most often the P-47 will drop its munitions regardless of enemy AA presence, and most of the time they get out, though some of the time their agility really screws with them. Moving on to the deck at the end of the week, not many changes until we get all the way down to the anti-tank tab. In the anti-tank tab, I did remove the M5 guns from Phase A and replace them with the M1s. I just found that I was using the M1s more and the versatility didn't really help me in any way. I just really didn't need it. Other than that, I didn't have any changes that I would have made to this deck, other than the ones I mentioned, such as maybe changing out the M3 howitzer for the 107s, and maybe changing out the flamethrower squads for more machine guns or the crocodile. However, for the most part, this was actually a lot of fun to play this week. I really enjoy 2nd Indian Head, and I always have. It's one of the decks that I always keep on standby, and it's kind of my deck I go to if I really need to have a medium-ranged engagement. These guys really excel at taking forests, as most NATO divisions do, and they also really excel at all of the things that make America great, such as bazookas and the ranger teams that just burn their way through almost any forest in the game. On top of this, their artillery tab is actually super strong. I didn't utilize it to its fullest because, as many of you know that have watched this series for any given time, I don't really like artillery in this game. However, it does have access to the long toms, it has access to the 107mm with the radio guidance, it has access to even more M3 howitzers, and you could potentially bring in more off-map if you delayed it to a later phase. However, for the most part, even without bringing in all of those other things, this artillery tab really excelled as opposed to most other artillery tabs that I've done throughout this series. The air tab was also really something. The fighter bombers in A have a sort of critical mass situation where if you're able to get all 3 of them running bombing runs all throughout Phase A, they're almost unstoppable throughout the rest of the game because they create sort of a rolling situation where the enemy is incapable of bringing up AA and units to cover the front, so one or the other is going to give. On top of this, a lot of the units in this division have really good value per the points you spend on them. Ranger Marauders probably being the most notable at 25 points that regularly kill a tank and a squad of infantry each time I bring them in, and that's just on average. Sometimes these guys go absolutely bananas and kill 30 squads of infantry, and I'm not even exaggerating on that number. On top of this, the tank tab is everything that I would hope for in a US division. It has access to the Shermans just to sort of spam them around, but it also has access to the Rhino if I need something that can deflect shots at range. These guys will distract Tigers and Panthers for a little bit, so long as you get them out of there before too long. My typical strategy with the Rhinos was to use them to tank shots for my Hellcats that were sneaking around in the background trying to do the actual killing. With the Hellcats, I would really advise turning off their HE unless you intend on really micromanaging them. The Hellcats have very limited HE, so it might not end up being a problem, but there's nothing worse than watching them get hung up on an infantry squad when you're trying to sneak them up on a Tiger and giving away your entire ambush. The M1 guns are also surprisingly great. I know I say this each time that I have access to a 57mm gun, be it the 6-pound gun, the M1, or even the ZIS-2, but the 57 really does surprise me each and every time I use it. It's just invisible enough that enemy tanks aren't likely to see it after even the first shot. However, it packs enough of a punch where it does significant damage to those tanks if they ever make the mistake of showing side armor. The M1 is in that perfect middle ground where it can penetrate most any side armor in the game at 2 kilometers, and because of that, any tank that sort of swivels to face another direction, be it towards your Rhino that you're micromanaging or just because the enemy isn't paying attention to it, will likely be disabled or killed right there on the spot. If I had to choose another standout unit, it would probably be the Rangers LMG, who really excel at a 20-point price tag. Being that you can bring in 12 of these per card in Phase B, you can kind of just flood them around, and they really do well at holding edges of forests or even the middle of a city that you've taken in Phase A. Add these to your huge number of machine guns that you have access to in the support tab, and you're unlikely to lose areas that you've managed to take throughout the earlier phases of the game. With the way I have this division built, you might see a little bit of a struggle if you make it to a really late end game, so something where a Juggernaut deck might actually excel. I bring in a lot of my stuff quite early, as I generally like to be quite aggressive. However, I could see dropping some things to Phase C if you'd like to play a more defensive style. Throughout the week, I managed to play this in quite a few different game types, and honestly, I don't know that there's a difference between 2v2s, 3v3s, or 4v4s with this division. It really excels at all of them. I'm not sure how this division does in 1v1 play, however, in team gameplay, I'd say that this is one of the top tier strongest divisions on the allied team. Of course, that might also be because it fits my playstyle the best, however, I just feel like it has a lot of really strong units that make it a really strong division. Honestly, if you're considering buying the Tribute to D-Day DLC, I would advise you do it. It has some of my favorite divisions in the game. It features 2nd US Indian Head that we've been going over today, as well as one of my other favorite allied decks, 6th Airborne for the British. It also features 3 of my favorite Axis divisions in the form of 17th Panzergrenadier, 3rd Fallschirmjäger, and 12th Hitlerjugend, which I've done videos on in the past. However, I just really enjoyed this DLC and all of the units that it added. However, with that out of the way, let's go ahead and move on to Koruck 559, and let me begin by saying, if Indian Head was fun throughout the week, then Koruck was my purgatory. Each and every time that I played this division, I felt like I was throwing the entire game. In fact, on multiple occasions, I only won through being carried by my allies and just trying my best to spam enough infantry onto the map that I wasn't completely worthless. With that in mind though, let's look at the nightmare that I created in this Koruck division. Now, I thought to make it a vanguard so that it would be so that I would be able to put up a lot of early game aggression and maybe be able to win before Phase C hit, where I really didn't want to play this in the way I've seen it played in the past. I didn't want to have 6 cards of Phase C SS Schwupo. I didn't want to do that. And so I just brought them all in Phase A and decided, you know what, if it's not over by like 10 minutes into Phase C, just give up. In Phase A, I brought in a card of the SPW 203Rs in the Recon tab, as well as the SPW ADGZs. Now, the ADGZs actually did quite well. These guys featured a 20mm gun that really suppressed infantry quite well, dealt with a lot of infantry blobs, and also had that Recon stat. To round it out, in Phase B, I brought in the Rona Sperrtrupp, and these guys were actually my real eyes and ears. Typically brought them in, set them on the edge of a forest, turned off all their weapons, and just prayed to the Recon gods. In Phase A in the Infantry tab, I brought in the Landesschützen OST, and the Sicherung, and the Pioneer, and the SS Schwupo Führer. Now, I kind of went over those really quickly, but honest to God, I don't know what the Landesschützen use for weapons, even though I'm looking at them right now. These guys are just kind of my spammable infantry in Phase A that feature a really good mid-ranged engagement due to their actually quite good squad support weapon. However, the Sicherung were also their 20-point infantry that featured something like a PTRS that usually worked out quite well. On top of this, the Pioneer cleared out forests, as you'd expect, and the Schwuppelführer were worthless in every single way. But I did end up bringing them in and tried to use them as sort of a command structure. I ended up finding out very quickly that command doesn't matter to these people. They just run away every time anything happens, so it didn't matter. In Phase B, I brought in a card of the SS Schwuppo as well as the Sperrband, or however it is you pronounce that. These guys were actually really good because they pack the Panzerschreck as well as a Panzerfaust, which feels incredibly redundant. However, whatever, a Panzerschreck is a Panzerschreck, and I will take it, even if it runs away every time it sees a tank. The Schwuppo were, well, they were there. They're 15 points. They didn't terribly disappoint me. In Phase C, I brought in another card of the Schwuppo as well as the Grenadier, and the Grenadier were also just 20-point infantry. It really didn't matter at some point. They just became more meat that I could just flood onto the earth. Mind you that I've played this as a Vanguard division. I've brought in a lot of infantry earlier than you otherwise would, and I still have access to 125 units of infantry. That seems absurd to me. It's absolutely obscene, and I found that a lot of my late game strategy was just sort of flood these infantry onto the earth, and typically there was just no way to deal with them because they'll just run away every time someone shoots at them and then eventually rally and come back. So they're very unstoppable in that exact way. However, since they've buffed machine guns and really nerfed blob strats, I don't know that this deck can even compete in that regard. Moving on to the very, very confusing tank tab. This thing is a nightmare. It has a trillion different tanks. All of the cards are 1 point each, so you want to bring in as many as possible. However, not any of these tanks are absolutely great. The Panzer IIIGs and the Tiger Es are good, as well as the T-34 1941s. However, everything else was kind of just there because it was 1 point and I felt silly not to. So I brought in a card of the Panzer VII TP, as well as a Panzer IIC and a Panzer T60 in Phase A. All of that rounded out by the Kampfpanzer III in Phase A also. Now, I, honest to God, don't know what any of these did for my war effort, but they seemed like the best options. However, I will say for the record that the T60s did quite well. The 20mm cannon on top of it really performed well, and I can't take anything away from it. However, the others were just kind of there, and I don't know that they were any more or less effective than a BA-10. However, at 25 points, I was able to get a ton of them onto the field all at the same time, and I think that's the real joy of them. I also brought in a Phase A card of the T-34-42, and these were my only good tanks in Phase A. These guys would typically box with their analog T-34s, but not really get any huge kills, and because I couldn't get very many of them, they didn't do terribly well. In Phase B, I brought in a card of the Panzer IIIGs, which ended up surprising me quite a bit, as well as a Phase B card of the Tiger Es at a forced 2-star veterancy. Now, the Tigers are good. I really enjoyed the Tigers, and I honestly think the Tiger is the only part of this division that actually worked the way I wanted it to. In Phase C, I brought in a card of the T-34-41s, and this was just to sort of give me some late game medium tank coverage, but at only 6 per card, it barely even did that. In the support tab, I brought in a Phase A card of the Flammenwerfer, just to get those early forests, but I don't know that these guys were really great at that, being that I also brought in the Pioneer and just a trillion infantry, so I don't know that I'd recommend these guys. I also brought in a Phase A card of the VK18.01s, and these guys are kind of cool actually. They feature 80mm of front armor and 2 machine guns mounted to the top. So if you use these guys inside of cities at 20 points, they're cheaper than the MG42, and they typically perform quite well, being that they can't be killed by enemy light AT such as PTRSs. All that said, if an enemy AT gun or enemy tank even looks at them, they're practically done for. I also brought in a Phase A commander because I was an idiot at the time. In Phase B, I brought in a card of the SMG-42s as well as the supply trucks. In the anti-tank tab, which was quite disappointing in its own way, I brought in the M42 in Phase A as well as the ZiS-3. In Phase B, I brought in another card of the ZiS-3s as well as the PaK-40s. Now, the M42s did quite well, however the ZiS-3 has its typical problem of being very easy to spot, not being incredibly effective, and these ZiS-3s actually lack the APCR that the Russian ones do, so just a little bit more on top of this horrible division. In the anti-air tab, I brought in a Phase A card of the 85mm anti-air guns that run away every time they're shot at, which, yay, anti-air that runs away. A Phase B card of the 88s, which actually ended up saving my life on more than one occasion, and a Phase C card of more cowardly anti-aircraft weapons. Honestly, I don't even know that I would bring in AA in this division that wasn't the 88. I don't know that it did anything. Every time that it fired at anything, it nearly always missed. It was so upsetting. But moving on to the artillery tab, I brought in the 105s in Phase A, which are still some of my favorite units, bringing them in the supply truck. I brought in a Phase B card of the Vielfachenwerfer, and these guys actually ended up impressing me quite a bit. Being that they fire so many rockets at such a tight area, they ended up suppressing quite a few things, even at one point killing an IS-2. I also brought in a Phase B card of the M30-122s in the supply trucks, and these were just to help me deal with heavy tanks, though I didn't end up using them more often than not, being that heavy tanks, what could they do to my horde of infantry other than pin down one or two of them? So oftentimes I think that this would have been a better card to have as any other artillery piece. Moving on to the air tab, I brought in the ME410 ATAC-1s in Phase B, as well as a Phase B card of 2-star veterancy ME109G TAC-6s to help me with my anti-aircraft weapons, although these were just disappointments with wings. In Phase C, I brought in the ME410 ATAC-1s, 2 cards of them. They have different munitions, however, in my typical fashion, these were just there to be my huge bombers that bombed things hugely. Moving on to my deck at the end of the week, I made a few changes, one of the most notable being I really found that I was running out of ways to deal with close quarters engagements, namely ones inside of forests. Once my Flammenwerfer and Phase A Pioneers went down, I really had no way to contest those other than sending just countless men to the slaughter against the enemy flame troops. To solve this, I brought in a Phase A card of the Chasseurs, which feature 9 MP40s, quite good in that engagement, as well as I brought in a card of the Rona Pioneer in the Infantry tab just to really help me in Phase B. I think it was idiocy for me not to bring in the Rona Pioneer to begin with, as these guys have SVTs as well as a DP-28, and they're absolutely fantastic. I think they actually might be better than regular Pioneer, but I digress. All this was at the expense of the infantry leaders that I had in Phase A in the Infantry tab before. I just found that I wasn't using them. In the support tab, I ended up dropping the command entirely in favor of the IG-290, as I just don't think that this deck really benefits from command in the way that I want it to. I thought to keep a nice little command line, however, most often the infantry would just go running away into the distance, and I just couldn't deal with that with the command, and then the command would be on the front lines, and it just ended up being a whole mess. So I found it just to be easier if the entire front line ran away together and then could come back together, and so that's what I ended up doing. In the anti-air tab, I dropped the Phase C card Flak 38s, as I don't know that they were doing anything, and in the air tab I dropped the Phase B card of ASF for a Phase A card of the HS-129 BTAC-2s, because I once ran into an IS-2 and literally had no way to deal with it in Phase A, and I don't know how that escaped my knowledge. I don't know how I didn't think about that, but this deck has ruined my brain. I think I've actually become mentally unstable because of this. Before I continue joking, I think it's worth noting that this division has its quirks. It has its little things that it actually does quite well. One of those is the pile of infantry that it has access to. While piles of infantry aren't the meta anymore, they are still quite good, especially in the numbers and how cheaply you can bring them in this division. The Shupo can be spammed to an unholy degree, and you can just create literal waves of flesh crashing upon the enemy lines, such that the enemies run out of ammunition trying to kill them all. Add this to the fact that they have a preponderance of cheap infantry and tanks in other tabs that are capable of supporting these infantry, and it's actually quite overwhelming. I could see this being quite good in, say, 2v2s, where you have an ally that could actually hold the entire map by themselves, where you could just send your units forward in some sort of bonsai kamikaze rush against the enemy. The air tab also didn't lack for too much. The ME410s were typically quite good, and the artillery tab ended up being quite good also. I forgot to mention this, but at the end of the week, I had also traded out the 105s in Phase A for the Nebelwerfer because I just needed something that could instantaneously break some area on the map, and honestly, I don't know that it was a huge change. With all of the positives out of the way, what the hell is this division? I can honestly say this was one of the most baffling things I've ever played. I've never played Koruck before this week, mostly because every time I've tried to make a Koruck division, I've looked at the tank tab, gotten completely overwhelmed by the amount of options, each of them being worse than the last, and just ended up deleting the entire division. And I think I was right to have done so in the past. Other than the infantry tab having an abundance of flesh, there's really nothing else going for this division. It has lackluster anti-tank, especially because it only has access to Panzerschrecks in the form of conscripts that run away each time a tank fires at them. The anti-air tab is nothing special, the artillery tab is nothing special, the air tab is nothing special, and the recon tab is lackluster at best, being that it doesn't get access to any of the really good SPW 231 or 233. Add all this to the fact that the support tab, while it's decent, again, is nothing special, and I just don't understand the purpose of this division at all. I don't know if it's good in 1v1s, I would assume it isn't, because I don't imagine this is good at anything. But I do know that the only thing I could see doing with this division is making it into a juggernaut division and just bringing in as many artillery pieces and infantry units as you possibly can, and eventually running the enemy dry on ammunition trying to kill all of your units. Honest to God, if you're a new player and you're thinking, what do I play? What division do I play? Never play Koruck, for the love of God. You will never play this game again if this is your first introduction to it, because this is just so frustrating. Nothing in this division actually works the way it should. Everything runs away every time anything fires at it, or your tanks just explode because they're all terrible and you can't tell them apart. I've been playing this game for over 1,500 hours, and I honest to God cannot tell what half of these units do while I'm playing the game. There are just so many of them to try and keep track of, especially the thousands of panzers that you have access to that are just, they're all unique in their own shitty way, and it's terrible to use this division. I'm sorry that if it sounds like I'm joking or if I'm memeing this division, I'm really not. This was so upsetting to play that it really ruined my ability to properly critique this division in any meaningful way. I don't even know if there's an easy fix to it. Perhaps if you were to add some Panzerschreck teams in the anti-tank tab, as well as maybe some more MG42 cards, and maybe some anti-tank options other than the ones presented, and maybe change out the entire tank tab, but I honestly don't know. I think this division is just a total meme and meant for the breakthrough mode that literally no one plays. All that said, I know there are better ways to have made this division. I've in fact referenced one of them. I think this is meant to be a late game division, and obviously being that it's a Phase C, even Eugen thinks that this deck is meant to be a defensive division, to really hold ground more so than take. However, in the current meta of the game, holding ground means absolutely nothing. You need to be able to push, and none of these units can do that. Each time you break cover with your infantry line, they just fall back. Each time your tanks break cover, they're killed by enemy light AT, and it just feels like a snowball rolling against you. So I really recommend against this division. All that said, that is going to do it for this week in review of 2nd US Infantry, as well as Koruck 559. Remember, if you'd like to see any specific decks covered, leave them in the comments below. And as always, I hope you've learned something.